So let's just, okay, yes, let's just start that. Then I would need to make a little comment.
Okay.
So-
We're going live now.
Thank you. Today's the 29th, 30th, 31st. 31st, thank you.
Madam Mayor, it is 6:02 and we are live.
Good evening and welcome to the March 35th special meeting, the March 31st, 2025 meeting of the Lake Worth City Commission regarding PPPs. Can I have the roll call, please?
Mayor Betty Resch,
Here.
Vice Mayor Sarah Maliga,
Present.
Commissioner Christopher McVoy,
Here.
Commissioner Mimi May,
Present.
Commissioner
And-
Anthony Segrich.
Present. And he's going to lead the Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay, Mayor, just before the pledge, I just wanted to let you know that Thomas John is available on Zoom.
Okay.
We getting underway?
Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So we have and I don't actually know your names, for which I apologize. You'll tell yourselves, but just
Jamie looks at Keith.
so I just want to say this is a presentation being offered, and we are going to hold all questions until the end. So take it away, Mr.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So public-private partnerships. As you guys are all aware, we have received unsolicited proposal. We're in the process of a proposed garage downtown, which is a P3. We have received another proposal as of last week. We've also had a meeting with a very prominent developer that's done a lot of major things in Vegas and some other places. So we have a lot of things coming in, and looking at what's happening in a lot of their municipalities like Boca, and you will hear about some tonight, pretty much all over the place. We're to a point now where we need to have some kind of policy in place. So when people come forward with an unsolicited proposal or something, we have something set so we know exactly what that process is going to be. Tonight is the beginning of that, where we can kind of get educated on how this works and some best practices and everything. So I can hand this over to Lisa to kind of introduce your team and move forward.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners, for having us here. I'm Lisa Bouillon, Executive Director of AI. We are a nonprofit that is focused on best practices for public-private partnerships. We do not sell the model, but we share information, education, and resources as you become more informed about the model and use it to deliver your critical infrastructure. How we do that is through workshops, presentations, fly-ins, and our members do the presentation. So with me today, Rodney Moss. Rodney is a board member for AI, and Thomas John. Thomas is online, and he is an AI ambassador, very well versed in the model, and we'll be sharing with you tonight. And Rodney, do you want to introduce yourself and then Tom?
Sure. Rodney Moss, Senior Vice President with Hunt Companies. I'm also the Chair of the Law and Legislative Committee for the AI and Treasurer of the organization. I have drafted 7 P3 statutes, one of which is Florida. I was on the drafting team for that. So I have intimate knowledge of the statute. I also have submitted 4 unsolicited proposals, so I have some battle scars from that, and in Florida. And I'm also involved in the Boca project as well. The Boca Raton City Center project. So my purpose here today is to try to do in 3 hours what it takes a year in our certification course to do. So that is no small feat, and most of the time when we do these, they're more ad hoc. This is the first time we're presenting in front of a full quorum of council, so it's going to maybe feel a little weird because I want you to ask questions as much as you can from the dais, just because it's just more engaging that way. So feel free to do that. I won't feel like I'm interrupted. I've got 55 slides. I don't want to talk to you all through all 55 slides. I want to talk to you about the things that are important to you all. So, Thomas, you want to introduce yourself?
Good evening. I apologize. I was due to be down there with you today, and the various airlines conspired against my attendance today. After several hours in the airport, I had to give up. So, Tom John, I'm a partner in the law firm of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister. I'm actually based out of our Indianapolis office, but I'm our chair of our public infrastructure practice. I've been involved in the P3 industry for about 20 years, a variety of deals from roads to bridges to buildings to parking garages, etc. And have been involved on the Law and Legislative Committee for AI and also significantly in Indiana working on statutes over the years. So happy to be here with you, well, be online with you. And, as Rodney said, these are oftentimes the more conversational, and the more you ask questions as you have them, probably better off we are to make sure we get everybody's questions answered, because we're here to answer your questions, not to preach at you.
And perhaps if there are questions, maybe writing them down so they stay fresh in your mind, and then we can address them if that's
At the end, that'd be
yes.
great.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, that's how we're going to do it.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Maybe we ought to take a vote as to how we're going to do it, because the gentleman who's presenting, who's the expert, said he would be quite happy to have questions along the way. I find that to be a more productive way than writing down and waiting to the end. If the gentleman presenting is okay with it, I would encourage us to follow his suggestion.
Thank you. Write your questions down and we'll present. Are there different sections of your presentation?
Somewhat, about
Okay.
3.
Okay, about 3. So let's do it that way. 1, 2, 3, and then questions at the end of 1, questions at the end of 2, and questions at the end of 3. Thank you.
Okay. So get started. So the Florida Public-Private Partnership statute is section 255-065. It was inserted as part of the procurement statute in the design build section, and I'll go through to the rationale for that. But it has specific verbiage around either solicited or unsolicited proposals, and you have the flexibility under your Florida statute to do either. The process for a solicited statute is that, a solicited project, which is the vast majority of the way these projects are procured, is through a solicitation, because it is all about public trust. It's all about taxpayer funds being used on infrastructure, and therefore you have that competition and I'll call it the process of procurement is sacred, and so it's important when you get into the unsolicited process and realm that you don't sort of forget all of that very, very important competition and analysis that goes on in a normally competed proposal. So in this section, it says if you're going to solicit, you basically do it through the Florida Administrative Register, 2-week solicitation, and if you're going to go with the unsolicited route, you can receive the unsolicited, you can accept it, and the unsolicited proposer has to pay the cost of the city's analysis of that proposal to determine whether that should be accepted. The cost of that analysis, some cities just set a fixed fee. Most of the time that fixed fee is inadequate. And so what the statute allows you to do is then tell the unsolicited proposer the amount that it's going to take to analyze this proposal, and they must pay that before you are obligated to analyze it. For big complex projects, that could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So The idea here is that an unsolicited proposer not burden staff who already have full-time jobs, and your advisors who already or whether it's your financial advisor or your legal advisor, your city attorneys, that it not create a financial obligation on the city to carry the proposal forward. So that's a very important part of the process. So in July of last year, the Florida legislature expanded the capability of government to accept unsolicited and not compete them. We in the industry foresaw that was going to create a little bit of a tidal wave of unsolicited proposals for various things that were, ideas in the community. And what would happen is exactly what has happened here, which is we don't have a process, we don't have the staff, we don't have the know-how. What do we do? So, this is really our first time where we've seen the stress from the changes that happened last year. Obviously, several cities, including Boca, have moved forward with unsolicited proposals, and it's been fine, just a little cumbersome, but they generally have managed them well. So Florida is kind of the epicenter of unsolicited proposals in the United States right now because of this change in the law. Scroll down just a little bit. So I'd like to focus on C1, which is at the bottom of the page there. So it says that you may proceed with unsolicited proposal without engaging in a public bidding process if you have two meetings, one meeting to review the proposal and then a second meeting at which you have to obtain public comment on that. And within that second meeting, you have to make a decision. The commission has to make a decision that moving forward with the proposal is in the public interest. And that has 5 components, as you can see there. You must consider the benefits, the financial structure, and the economic efficiencies, the qualifications of the entity that submitted the proposal, the compatibility of the infrastructure plans, and then address all public comments that occurred at the meeting. And once you've done that and you decide to move forward, then you have to publish a report in the Florida Administrative Register that lays out the public interest factors in C above, and the findings for that. In other words, you have to lay out the rationale for the decision. So that was the major change in the statute last year. And so if you decide to accept the proposal, you can compete it or you cannot compete it under that new process. Any questions on that? That's kind of the first segment. Yes.
Yes, I do have questions on that.
Well, I'm calling on you. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful what you've told us, that Florida, that was the impression I got too, that legislation change in July was opening a wave that perhaps municipalities in Florida are not necessarily fully prepared for. Certainly one of the things that when I did a good governance course down in Miami-Dade in the past, they said PP3s are not necessarily good or bad. The difficulty is that the public side is almost always outgunned, way out resourced, out experienced, out everything. And so it's not a level playing field. So it's easy for it to go a little bit south from the public side. And it seems like your organization is very well aware of that and helping us. A question, a very specific question. You mentioned that the statute has to do that the public side, which I'm assuming the public side is the elected body.
Yes.
Has to do a finding of in public interest.
Yes.
I don't know whether there's a definition anywhere of in public interest and how specific it is. I don't remember reading that when I last looked at this, but I would guess that there's a certain amount of latitude there. But I have one specific question with it. it says that the finding and the rationale for the finding has to include and address public comment. Is that only public comment from the first meeting or public comment from both meetings?
It's not clear on that, but I'm going to say it's both meetings because until you've addressed the public comment, then you're not supposed to move forward with so I think if you restrict public comment without the deliberation on why it's in the public interest, you have to also entertain that comment as well and address those.
That leads me to a comment, an observation that our most recent unsolicited proposal.
Mr. McVoy, that's not a question. We'll have time for comments at the end. Ms.
Madam,
May,
I have a question
you
with
said
it.
you have a comment, not a question.
I-
Please.
Sometimes questions need a little explanation.
Well-
The gentleman is not familiar with it. So we had a situation recently with a major unsolicited one. And the finding of in the public interest, I was informed as a member of the elected body, was prepared prior to that second meeting. I had a difficulty with the concept that we are finding it in the public interest if we prepare our finding before we found anything.
What
I'm
is your
wondering,
question?
my question is, did we follow procedure in doing it that way?
So the finding of public interest is basically a finding that competition and entertaining other proposals is not going to yield any additional benefit to the taxpayer. So the finding of public interest is not so much about the project per se. It's basically saying that in our good practice here, we find that competing this is going to get either no qualified additional proposals that will be competitive, and therefore we will be wasting everybody's time. That's the only public interest decision. It's not about the project per se. It's
About the process.
It's about process.
So how does one know before putting out a solicitation for proposal that there would be no benefit? Because you started the presentation by saying that the vast majority of government work for years has been done with competitive process.
Yeah.
And there's a good reason for that.
Yeah.
It builds in many more safeguards, it builds in public trust, all those things. So how could one find as an elected body that we don't think we're going to learn anything useful by competing this, even though years of experience says that that's the best way to do it?
I think some of this will be answered as.
All right.
Okay, and Ms. May has a
I,
question.
I turned my light off.
Oh,
My question was
yeah,
answered.
and I don't think you're here to answer hypotheticals.
No,
Thank you.
absolutely not.
If one is proposed, if a hypothetical is proposed, please feel free to say, we don't do
Yeah,
hypotheticals.
I will not
Thank you.
step into a political process.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's go next slide. So the definition of public-private partnership can be very ambiguous. I can tell you what it is not. It is not a real estate transaction. It is about the delivery of infrastructure. So if it's a public asset, the question about public-private partnership is it the best delivery method given the risk of the transaction for a public asset? So there are lots of varieties, and we're going to get into those in a minute. But again, think about it in terms of a parking garage that is a public asset. Think about it in terms of a park, a street, a community center, a city hall, it is not a real estate transaction. And that's where things get conflated a lot around these deals, because when you talk about financing and operating and maintenance risk, it's about how that asset is going to be financed, built, maintained over its full life cycle as a public asset. And in so understanding that business case of choosing P3 as a delivery method for that infrastructure, you're saying that the qualitative and quantitative factors around that asset, mainly risk, but it could also be urgency, it could be complexity of different varieties. That risk is better transferred to the private sector because they can manage it better, as opposed to a traditional delivery, which is a lot of risk on the public sector balance sheet. Next slide. Tom, I promise I'm going to involve you, but I just got to get through this piece. All right. So this is a slide that shows the delivery methods that are options for the delivery of infrastructure. So on the lower left is design, bid, build. That's the traditional bid procurement for public infrastructure. So as you go up the arrow towards the right, what you're doing is you're transferring more risk than you would under design, bid, build. So you go to design, build, where you're transferring design risk related to an infrastructure asset. Then you go to what we call the DBOM, which is a design, build, operate, maintain, where you are getting the private sector to design and build your asset, but also maintain it. Could be for a short period, could be for a long period. When you get into the green options, which is kind of what we call P3, where it involves some level of finance, you have design, build, finance, which is basically a build to suit. In other words, you're paying the private sector to develop, build, design, build, and do a construction financing on this and buying it from them at the end, but only paying for it when it's done to your satisfaction. The next option is design, build, finance, maintain, which could be a longer term than just the completion of the project. It could be for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever creates value for the public sector in transferring that risk of maintaining that asset. So then going up, we have what's called design, build, operate, maintain, availability payment. That is the equivalent of a lease. It's an equivalent of what we call a capital lease. So a capital lease means that you're effectively buying the asset through a lease payment, but in so doing, you're transferring the risk of that asset being available and performing according to the criteria that you specified. So it could be energy performance, could be technology, it could be a lot of things around how that asset performs. And if it does so, then you pay the payment for that, yearly, monthly, whatever the lease term is. And then on the upper right is what we call a revenue risk, a design, build, finance, operate, maintain revenue risk, which means that you have transferred the financial performance of that asset. So for example, if it's a parking garage, right? And that parking garage is based upon being able to service the debt of that, wanting to do it off balance sheet, i.e. it's not on your balance sheet. It is paid for by the revenue it generates. Then that's what we call a revenue risk or demand risk delivery. Oftentimes we see that delivery is an over transfer of risk, and I'll get into that in a minute. But when you transfer financial performance risk and sort of how this thing is going to perform financially, it can get expensive. But I'll explain to you in a minute that risk is on somebody's balance sheet no matter what. The question is, how are you financing it? How are you transferring risk? Tom, you want to step in here and talk about kind of the assets that are being delivered with public-private partnerships?
Sure. So the reality is there, as Rodney has sort of set the stage, there are different aspects to whether you have revenue attached or don't have revenue attached. But the bottom line is there's, I think, a seminal piece to P3s, which is at the end of the contract, are you going to own the asset? And if it's an asset that in one way, shape, or form you're going to own, then it's subject to that. If you're selling a piece of property, it's a land deal, as Rodney was talking about. If you're not going to own it, then and it's not going to be a public asset, then it won't be. But what can it be applicable to? As you can see from this slide, anything that has a public purpose, that has a public investment in it, that has public ownership attached to it can be a P3. And the reason many of these are ideal P3s or ideal candidates for P3 is the risk. In big projects, oftentimes an integrated delivery will provide you a tighter schedule, that you have somebody that is one entity that is responsible for the delivery rather than going through a typical design bid build process where you've got multiple entities that may end up blaming each other if there are problems. Also, these may be ones with heavy regulatory or complicated processes. There again, where you want that to be held really within one unit to transform. We could go through a variety of these and give examples of ones, whether in the US, in Canada, or other places where you've seen these types of facilities. I'm not going to list them all off there, but they give you a sense that if it's a public asset you want to own and one that you want to ensure is well maintained throughout the period of the contract, and one that you want to make sure is delivered expeditiously, oftentimes it's a good candidate for it.
So a lot of times we see a mix of these kinds of assets, transit-oriented developments like the one that's happening in Boca on the Brightline. The Brightline was a P3 originally, and now the city is developing a transit-oriented development on that Brightline station. So sometimes you mix and match these things into a integrated systematic delivery where the assets, because they rely on each other, have to occur well at the same time. I'm going to skip some of these. All right. So just to summarize what we were saying, it is a toolbox for infrastructure. Every delivery method that we showed on that chart with those bubbles has a business case. So understanding the business case for the delivery method you choose for your infrastructure is vital, because if you're just doing a sewer repair in the street, that should not be a P3. If you are building a new city hall, that may or may not be a P3, but if it's part of an integrated development, a mixed use town center, then you start getting into, maybe I need to be thinking about, because all of this has got to connect really well and it's got to lift together, and it's all about activation and placemaking and all those things. You tend to get better outcomes when you integrate it all into a public-private partnership. So from a public sector perspective, you always retain ownership. It is infrastructure. It is a public asset. It goes much faster in general than traditional delivery. It transfers risk much better than traditional delivery methods. You can make sure that the asset is well maintained and the funds are there to maintain it, and that when it's handed back to the public sector, it's done in a like new condition. So you don't get this deferred maintenance and all of these things. And if it's done right, it will result in substantially lower costs to the taxpayer because of the risk that is being transferred. And I'll get into some of that in a minute. And again, you have these performance guarantees. You're not paying for stacking one brick on top of another. You're paying for performance. And therein lies the magic of a P3. From the private sector's perspective, it's all about taking risk and making investments and therefore earning a profit on the risk that you take. Generally, they tend to be very innovative because the more innovation you can bring and the more power of what you're doing you can bring through innovation, the more successful you're going to be. So they tend to be very innovative, more so than traditional delivery. And the process should always be competitive. When you actually go out and do that procurement, whether it's for the contractors or the debt or the whatever, you should always have competition at the level at the most practical time. And I'll get into how the industry is addressing that on the social infrastructure side in a minute. So the benefits of a P3: schedule discipline, budget certainty. They should always be cheaper, greater innovation, transferring the life cycle risk. Public never loses control. It is the most effective way to transfer risk that the public sector tends not to manage very well because of the complexity. And again, you're paying for performance. Where's that graphic? So a P3 is always transparent. It always looks at things from a life cycle approach rather than lowest first cost. It always looks at ways to share risk in a way that optimizes the value of the risk transfer and not stranding risk that ultimately resides on the public sector balance sheet. What it is not privatization. It is not usually a short-term contract. And I'll get into this in a minute. It is not a funding solution. And it is not the right answer for every project. As I said, every delivery method has a business case. And so you've got to go through that analysis, and we call it value for money. I'll go through it in a minute. Now, when I say it's not a funding solution, and I'm going to repeat myself a lot on this point, infrastructure is only paid by 4 sources of revenue: taxes, user fees, grants, or what the government recognizes as part of the development, i.e. transacting the land. That's it. There's no other source of money to pay for infrastructure. Now, if you think about funding as an input, so you can't, if you don't have the funding, then you can't afford it, and therefore you shouldn't build it. What P3 does is look at, given that funding source and the timing of it, is it here now? Will it be here in the future? What is the financing option that allows us to get the asset if it's critical when we need it? Or what is a financing option that transfers risk in a more appropriate way? i.e. we shouldn't put taxpayer funds into something that's completely speculative. We should wait till that actually occurs. If it's new development, new revenue, then you would want the private sector to finance that until the development and the ad valorem is on the ground. Then you would do a traditional financing with the funding that is there, right? So it's really important that as we go through this, we think about infrastructure, 4 ways to fund it. The creativity in P3 is how to finance it. Wow, what happened to these slides? All right, so as I said a minute ago, it's not free money. It is, because it's infrastructure and it is only from those 4 sources, the question then is, Is it financeable? Is it bankable? Is the revenue stream certain enough that it can be financed at a reasonable cost of capital compared to a traditional muni financing that you would do every day when you issue bonds or whatever? So, wow, that is, our slides don't look look like they do on our computer. So there's 4 buckets of risk on any project. Development risk, which is entitlement, land acquisition, floodplain, site conditions, all those things that affect, is this the right place and right land for the project? Is it going to be properly entitled? The next bucket of risk is what we call completion risk. That is where the traditional public procurement comes in. That is where you're able to transfer the risk of the completion of the project. So you have it developed. Now you go out and bid it, or however you do it, to get the project built. Again, that is around design risk, cost risk, schedule risk, site conditions risk, those kinds of things. That is the risk bucket that traditional delivery addresses. But you still have a ton of risk on your balance sheet that oftentimes is not accounted for. Life cycle risk. Is the asset going to perform and be maintained at the budget that we have established for it over its entire life? Will the systems be refurbished and replaced when they wear out? Air conditioners, all those kinds of things, right? And then the 4th bucket of risk that you have is demand risk. As I said, unless there's revenue generated by the asset, that risk may or may not be there. For example, a city hall generally tends not to have demand risk. A parking garage will have demand risk. So what P3 does is it takes all of those buckets of risk and analyzes the whole cost of ownership of the asset over its life. What is it going to cost, and who's going to pay for it, and when are they going to pay for it? So that you have a fully funded, optimized risk transfer of what it means to own an asset. So when we talk about value for money, that is the taxpayer benefit of the delivery method, right? Value for money means, am I getting good value for how I'm procuring this asset? Again, it's that value tends to be driven by the risk of ownership of that asset. So what you're doing when you're looking at the business case for the delivery method is you're trying to find that optimum VFM. If you under transfer risk, you destroy value. If you over transfer risk, you destroy value because you're overpaying for the risk transfer. You're looking for that optimum place where through the risk transfer, you're creating better value than the other procurement methods would provide.
Can you give an example?
Sure.
Like, what's an example of a project where it would be appropriate? How do you get to that sweet spot? But like, give an example, not like of an actual thing.
Sure. So,
You don't have to.
well, I'm happy to. I mean, a parking garage, for example, right? A parking garage, a lot of times depends on technology. How you create the most revenue for that parking garage based on the demand, whether it's dynamic tolling, whether it's getting people in and out, whether it's charging a fee in lieu for people that don't want to build parking and can use the garage and pay a fee for it. So there's a lot of sort of technology and sort of really analytical demand risk for that garage. If the city were to say, well, I'm just going to go build a garage and you know, I mean, charge some nominal fee for it, that doesn't mean that you're optimizing those revenues and you're optimizing the utilization of that garage in a way that services the debt and pays for it as quickly as possible and provides a public service. A toll road, for example, a toll road, gets potholes. It requires a ton of maintenance. It requires a ton of upkeep that if it's not done well, then the asset's not going to perform well. People will not choose to drive on that toll road. So understanding what that whole cost of ownership is and where the risk factors are in that asset performing the way it's supposed to is the analysis you have to go through. And like I said, it's not for every project. If you look at just traditionally, about 1 in 7 projects should be a P3 because of the complexity and the urgency and the risk transfer and all those kind of things.
Rodney, to kind of add in a couple of examples on this. One is City of Indianapolis. This is probably 20 years ago now, had their library board decided to add a significant parking garage to a historic facility, the main library branch. And it was originally to be about an $80 million garage. This is a while ago. And the board decided to do it classic design, bid, build. And there were errors made. And the civil engineers blamed the structural engineers, blamed the contractors constructing the garage. The litigation ended up with the city paying, I think all in was about 140 million that it was out by the time it was said and done, with millions of dollars having gone to legal fees. That is risk that you wouldn't have had under an integrated delivery where you had a contract with the private P3 developer to deliver you a garage, not for the government entity to have to manage that garage, right? Because the risk of ensuring that all these parties are working together would have been held with the private P3 developer rather than with that public board, which was in the middle of each of those litigations. So that's one place where you're capturing that risk, is that delivery risk that Rodney's talked about. But I'll give you another is Indianapolis did a concession of its parking meters about 15 years ago. When the concession was done, there hadn't been a parking fee raised in about 20 years. The city routinely had about $1.5 million in unpaid parking fees that would roll off the books because they hadn't been collected. And it was costing the city about $300,000 a year to do it. They had people carrying these heavy vaults that they would dump the quarters in around town. And the city did a concession. And at the end of that concession, you had a new parking system that now, instead of the meters and the quarters, people could pay with their phones. And they could get updates. So if their meter was running out, they'd get a text message on their phone. It increased compliance enormously. And the private partner also ensured collection now rose north of 90% on all of those unpaid parking tickets. The net result is, I believe last year the city had netted, after the private sector had taken its return out of the project, more than $8 million, as opposed to spending $300,000 prior to the contract. So those are a couple of opportunities where literally one is you avoid the risk that you run into of having to manage, because the fact is, even if you build 3 parking garages, it's hard to have that internal expertise to ensure that all the vendors are operating the way that they should. Whereas the private sector can build dozens or more across the country. And similarly, you only operate one parking system, whereas you may be able to bring in a concessionaire who operates 20. And so you get the benefit of those best practices you wouldn't otherwise.
So there's a parking garage in Annapolis, Maryland that my company did. The old garage was past its useful life, had to be replaced. It was too small. They were undercharging for parking. It was in the middle of a historic district. The public amenity directly adjacent to it is called City Dock. It was experiencing about 60 days a year of flooding, and they needed to really enhance the park and build flood walls and so on to protect the park and protect the downtown business district. So the idea was bring the public sector in, optimize the parking demand, optimize the size of the garage and how much it costs to the profit for the garage to pay for the flood resiliency. And in so doing, through a timing process, because they were able to show that they had a financeable plan, they were able to trigger about $30 million of federal FEMA grants to increase the scope of the garage that they could the City Dock improvements that they could otherwise afford. And so what ended up happening was they ended up getting $100 million project from a $35 million garage. If that makes sense, because the private sector took the risk of the money that was going to be spun out to help finance the City Dock improvements and the flood walls, and took the risk of delivery of that and the design of that and the cost certainty of that. And they were able to leverage that, that revenue stream exponentially better than they could have done on their own.
Is that Eagle Alley in Annapolis?
Yeah.
My father had a boat there for years. Mr. McBoy, you have a quick question? And then Ms. Malega?
I have several questions. Would your understanding be that both risks and benefits in these projects should be pretty equally shared between the public and private sector?
The risk should reside with who can best manage it. So there are risks that are not manageable, that you simply, can't, they're black swan events, right? There are certain risks, whether it's political risk or site conditions risk or something that literally cannot be known. Those risks should be shared to the point that you get good risk management, but not shared completely. That is the over transfer risk scenario I was talking about, where you're overpaying to transfer that risk of something that really cannot be managed. So some risks should be transferred completely. Some risks should be retained by the public sector completely. And some risks should be shared in a way that creates value for the taxpayer.
How do you, who should be the entity that does that evaluation of the risk transfer? Because obviously the private party has a certain interest and they're going to do the analysis a certain way. How do you get an independent analysis of that?
There are lots of advisors out there that do that for a living. And that's what they do, is they advise the public sector and do these value for money studies. And they go through a fulsome analysis of the risks and look at, based on hundreds of precedent projects, where good value was created through risk transfer. And they analyze your project, and then they come up with this value for money analysis that says, here's the line of risk transfer that we think you will get good competition from the private sector on. If you try to do more than that, you're going to be paying a premium, which is never good. So there are lots of advisors that do that. We deal with them every day, and it's a bit of a niche industry, but it's very effective and works.
And part of, just a follow up on yours. You can go back. I'll go back. In terms of, would part of their analysis be how much we charge for the parking?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
Just so-
for example,
Yes.
on that Annapolis project, we came in and looked at their whole central business district and said, here is the catchment area. Everything needs to work as a system. The street parking, the garage parking, and then there were neighborhoods in the catchment area. And we did again, advisors that experts in parking looked at, here is the right charge for the right event, for the right time of day, for the right this, right that. And we came up with it's an investment grade financial analysis of, yeah, that's how much this parking garage could and should generate.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McCoy.
I'd like to add on to that one a little bit. If a firm were to do an analysis like that, let's say that you have 5 communities in an area, and 4 of them charge for parking, and 1 of them doesn't, street parking. Would that analysis, before, particularly like you say, an investment grade analysis, would that analysis not want to look at the competitive advantage that the city that doesn't charge for parking confers to their businesses, and that somehow you've got to think about, not necessarily easily, but resource economists do these kind of things. What's our gain going to be? What's our hit going to be? Is that something that would be a part of such analysis?
Yeah, that again, it's all a demand analysis, right? It's saying what are the days, what are the times of day, what are the events where there is going to be demand for this parking? And they will look at where people are undercharging for parking that might drive that behavior to go park over there as opposed to pay for it. And they will look at sort of that fills up first. You're going to have a certain segment that always is willing to pay more to park closer. So yeah, it factors all of that in, because parking inherently is a system, right? It's a system, and you got to make the system work. And if there's something out of balance, it's gonna distort the system.
And we'll go through advisors a little bit more. And also we have plenty of resources on the website that I think will answer those questions more directly.
I did have one, just to clarify and make sure I understood it. You mentioned at one point the process should always be competitive. And can you flesh that out a little bit? Do you mean that if a public entity is thinking about going to a P3, you do a RFP type process to find people who are interested in doing that P3, or do you mean something different?
So I'm gonna cover that in great detail in a minute. So it varies how you get the maximum practical competition. What we're seeing across the industry is what's called progressive P3 or progressive development, and that is where you go through all of this risk transfer, all of this business case. You figure out which risk should be shared, which risk should be retained, which should be transferred. And through that, you jointly come up with a process by which you compete things at the right time when the risks are sufficiently known. And I'll go through it in a second.
Ms. Malega?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Hi. So I actually was in Boca and got to see your presentation about a year and a half ago. And I brought some of that information back when I made decisions on a parking garage that we just went through. And so I'm thankful that everybody up here is hearing the same fantastic information, because I'm not an expert, but you're teaching it well. I just want to go back on a couple of things. And I remember from a year and a half ago that you talked about political champions. And through this process that we just went through with the garage, there are certain electeds who think, why would investors take a risk? They're just here to get our land. They're just here to take something from us. And then they don't trust the analysis that we do have done when we have experts sitting here and saying, here are your peak parking times, here are your peak hours. Well, I don't think that was real data. So I remember that you talked about how do we get those political champions that you talked about? And it's in the information you passed out earlier.
Right.
How do we engage those, right? Like, how do we make sure that we're getting the information out to the people to understand that we're not just spending taxpayers' dollars, that we've done, and I'll say I've done my due diligence. I've run the numbers. I've seen the schematic. I know that I'm making the best vote for what the information I've been given, but it really is about those political champions. And I remember you talking about that, is how do we facilitate that more? Because you can have as many public meetings as you want. And again, time constraints and people working, they're not going to get the information. And all they're going to see are yellow parking tickets all over town that people are passing out saying that we're spending taxpayers' money on building a garage. They don't see the backstory. So I'm hoping that you'll touch on that a little bit.
I will. I'll
And
go through
on
the
how
10
to
success
on how to
factors.
build
Okay.
that aspect for our city.
Thank you. Miss May.
Oh, thank you. I just have a question. When you were talking about hiring, like basically hiring a consultant to do the risk analysis, does it matter? I'm thinking about who pays for that study. And I think I remember that if it was an unsolicited bid, then they pay. And if it's a solicited bid, we pay. Is that how
Yes,
it goes, or is
That's
it?
how it goes. And there are some nuances to that. And I'll
Okay.
get into some of that.
Yeah, I remember reading that and thinking about that. And then I'm good on that. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy.
And for the first time, Mr. Segridge.
Well,
It's a
yeah.
different thing.
Different crazy.
Your light's still on.
So my question.
Turn your mic on.
My question's on mitigating the delivery risk. So if you transferred the delivery risk to the developer, the private entity,
Are you talking about completion risk or development risk? Because that's not clearly one of the,
completion risk.
Okay.
So, you brought up an example of where the city had a lot of failures and it ran way over budget. What happens when the private sector kind of falls out? Would that be protected by some sort of performance bond? How does the city protect itself from that?
yes, you should always have performance security for any obligation that's being undertaken. Now, that can take a lot of forms. Surety is one way to do it. Letters of credit, parent guarantees, lots of other sort of risk transfer mechanisms, but every risk should be backstopped so that you have certainty around the risk you've transferred.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's keep going.
On your Indianapolis example, that Mr. Jones mentioned, if the city had maybe stronger owners reps, would that have been a way of, or perhaps better performance securities, letters of credit in place? What I'm trying to understand is one way to deal with risk is through these P3s, but there are other ways to deal with risk as well. And certainly anybody, for years, as you mentioned, most projects are done with an RFP. And usually there's a 20%, 10% built in, there's an owner's rep, there's various ways that you can avoid these kind of problems.
So I was talking about two different projects there. One was the parking meter, which was a P3. The one I talked about that had the overruns was not a P3.
Right.
But
Correct.
had you had a P3 in that circumstance, you would have had the P3 developer would have been responsible for those overruns and mediating them. And in fact, all of those entities involved in that did have sureties, and the sureties don't want to pay out, and they're happy to sue each other in the process if you have different parties that are each claiming responsibility by another, whether it be an engineer, whether it be a constructor or whatever. The point is, by having a P3 process, you aren't in the middle of that getting sorted out. The P3 developer is, and they're the one that is managing it.
Yeah, it's when you have an integrated delivery where you have transferred the risk to people that are expert at managing that risk, they tend not to have those outcomes. I mean, I in all my 20 years of doing P3s, those train wrecks of traditional delivery generally do not happen because you've got one throat to choke, and they're the ones that are making sure that those risks are being identified and managed appropriately at the appropriate time. And when you have this fragmented sort of responsibility to entities that are not able to respond financially to the risk, is when you get those kinds of outcomes. I can go on all night about insurance policies and letters of credit and how, I know, I'm just saying it's an art more than it is a science, but understanding the complexity of that risk and what you're retaining through your delivery method and what you're transferring and knowing that that is creating value is the analysis that you have to do.
Thank you.
So this is a value for money study. And basically what it says is if we were to deliver this traditionally, here's what it would cost. And that's what we call a public sector comparator. And then you match against that a P3 delivery. And as you can see here, it might cost a little more to deliver it with P3 on a first cost, which is what we call the base cost. It might cost a little more to finance it if you decide that's what you want to do. The big swing in the value for money on a P3 is what we call retained risk, right? It is if something goes wrong, who's going to pay for it? And so what happens is through the financing, through the potentially higher first cost, because they built things more robust, or they spent more money to do peer reviews, or they got insurance policies from their designers to make sure that if something went wrong, that they had insurance to cover it. That retained risk piece is where the value proposition of P3 is, because you're lowering what traditionally was $26 on public sector balance sheet down to $7 through the risk transfer. So in 2020, the Congressional Budget Office said something that the rest of the world already knew. We're the only country in the world that has tax exempt municipal debt. But basically they said, if you adjust for risk, the cost of private financing and the cost of public financing are roughly the same. So when your financial people say, well, we can finance it for 4%, and the public and the private sector is 5.5 or 6%, 150 basis points. That is the cost of risk that is embedded in the transaction that you're not recognizing through a traditional delivery.
Yeah.
And again, this came from a Congressional Budget Office, and they analyzed PABs and the things that were being done at a federal level with big complex projects. And there was this myth that they were overpaying, and they analyzed it and they said, you're actually not overpaying, you're transferring risk and you're paying for that transfer. So this is a hypothetical matrix of risks that are involved in any given project. And you can see here a traditional delivery is everything's blue, because those are the risks that are typically being retained by the public sector in a traditional delivery. And as you go across, you can see the delivery methods as it goes to yellow and peach. Those are the risks that are being transferred to the private sector off of the public sector balance sheet. So again, now we're going to switch gears, and we're going to go into sort of the finance side and sort of how to think about that cost of capital. Again, funding is an input. It only comes from 4 places for a public asset. Financing is an output. Financing is where you bring in different debt structures. You bring in federal loan programs, TIFIA, RIF, and all the federal loan programs. You bring in subordinated debt. Things that are going to create efficiency and flexibility when it's time when you de-risk the deal and it's time to take it on balance sheet and finance it with traditional financing with tax exempt debt. That is the art of P3, is what is the weighted average cost of capital that's going to create best value for the taxpayer through risk transfer. Now, again, remember I talked about one of the delivery methods at the beginning is design, build, finance, where you're only transferring development risk and completion risk. You're buying the asset at the end when you're happy with it. So when I say financing, I'm not talking about long-term financing. I may just be talking about a short-term construction financing but you're not paying for stacking one brick on top of another. You're paying for a performing facility.
The product.
The product. Then you think about what your debt does on a traditional muni financing where you buy it at the end. You have that certainty, and now your only risk is the life cycle risk. You can also do a design build small f construction financing and maintain, where you have the developer say maintain it for 5 years until it's stabilized and you're satisfied that it's doing what it's supposed to. So there's a lot of nuances in how you slice this risk in terms of creating that optimum value for money. Let me stop or question.
Ms. Malega?
With the design build, the DBF, we have the ability for the design outset, like we get to design it. We have the design oversight.
You always have control over design.
Okay.
There is no design decision that you don't have control over. Now, does a design decision that you make it unaffordable for the sources of revenue that are there? That's another question. But you always have the ability to say yes or no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I teach sixth grade, so let's break it down here. So is that like the lady that changes her mind 75 times about paint colors? And then that would be the part that obviously we would have to pay for. But in general, if I tell you what color paint I want and you do the paint, that's my choice.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's much more.
I mean, on a bigger scale, but I mean, brought down.
So there are two projects that are good examples of this: Miami-Dade Courthouse and the Travis County Courthouse.
Okay.
Both P3 projects, both started at the same time in terms of procurement. The Miami-Dade Courthouse did what is called a fixed bid contract, where they took 4 teams through a full design competition and they got a fixed bid to select the awarded bidder. Well, the problem is that was done in a vacuum. And when they gave the price and they accepted the price, that was it.
Oh.
So the ability to do things like change your mind depends on how you procure it. Travis County went through what we call progressive. I want to go through this in a minute, where we went through 9 months of making a lot of those decisions and understanding, well, if I do this, then it's going to cost that. And if I turn it this way, it's going to cost that much more, whatever. And we went through, a $7 million process of designing it, but they knew when they made a financial commitment to that project, exactly what they were going to get, everything that it was collaborative, and it was a consent agenda decision because they were part of the process.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Mr. McBoy.
Yeah, I was, that example of the two, Travis and Miami-Dade, helps a little bit, but you had stated that the public side would always have an influence on the design. Let's say it's something that's designed by an architect, a building, presumably. I would guess that there are many cases where the public side, that the private side is going to say, no, this is the design we want, and we're sorry, that's the design we want. And so how does that reconcile with what you're saying, that the public side in a P3 is always going to have?
So the way Miami-Dade was done, for example, they had 4 teams that went through a year-long process, and they call them one-on-one meetings, where they present something and then they, in a very formal way, get comments back. I don't like that. I don't like that. This is wrong. Do it this way, whatever. And so then they would go away and they'd come back and they would respond to those comments. So they took 4 teams through that very expensive, long process until they converged everything to more or less kind of what they wanted, or they like different things about different ones, but they picked the one they liked the best at the end of that process and got a fixed bid for that. So they had the influence. Now, once they chose that fixed bid and they changed their mind, it got very expensive. And that's what's happened on Miami-Dade.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So one of the things that happens in a progressive delivery, particularly on a social infrastructure, if you think about like what I just described think of Miami-Dade at the top bar and Travis County at the bottom bar, right? You're doing all of this screening, advising, all these advisors are there at the outset. They're really making that RFP tight and making sure that everything, the design criteria is exactly the way they want it. Then they go and they solicit proposals, and then they go through this process, and then they announce the winner, and then they go to commercial close, finalize the contracts. The bottom one, progressive, is you don't have all those advisors necessarily at the beginning. You select a team that is qualified and gives you the competition on the things that should be competed at that point, i.e. fees, development fees, design build fee, cost of capital. They bid those as a percentage, right? So you fix that thing. Now you got to figure out what it is you're building, how much you can afford, what is the finance structure that creates the best value. So you've taken all of that analysis and decision-making and put it after developer selection in a very collaborative sort of way. Getting back to the question about who pays for these advisors that was at the beginning. On the top one, the public sector pays for those advisors to get that tight RFP out. Could be very expensive. The bottom one, the developer is responsible to pay your advisors to analyze what they're doing and all that collaboration. If you decide to terminate, you must reimburse the developer for their out-of-pocket costs. It's effectively the same cost you would have spent anyway. It's just you're getting the developer to sort of be on the hook for it. If you terminate, as I said, you reimburse the developer. If you don't terminate, you move forward with the project, it just gets paid at financial close and gets baked into the financing. So you're committed, but you're not out of pocket all this advisory cost, because the developer is actually funding the advisors that you need in that pre-development period. Right.
What, I'm sorry, what? Well, they'll get paid back at the time of closing?
Well, it's reimbursed as part of the closing costs. And if you terminate for your convenience,
Well, yeah,
something they can't control,
Sure.
then
of course.
right. But that's how you do your municipal financings anyway. When you get all these engineers doing all this stuff, you bake it into the bond financing, right? So it all gets rolled in. So it's effectively the same way, but it's about cash flow. It's about, timing of making all those decisions, doing it up front or doing it during the design and analysis process.
Mr. McBoy?
In either of those processes, the traditional or fixed price and the progressive, when you've described a process where there's quite a bit of communication back and forth between the developer, the private side, and the public side, who is that public side at that point? Is that staff or is that the elected body?
It's both. And so it's basically divided up into three periods of time. The first 90 days, you're figuring out what can I afford? What do I want? Where is it? You're figuring out the feasibility of the project. At that point, the developer comes in and gives you an estimate of here's what it's going to cost. Here's how long it's going to take. Here's how much, risk transfer we think is a good value for you. And you get a decision point at that point, stop or go forward. The next one, roughly 90 days later, you've got a good bit of design. You've started thinking about, you've done your soils investigations. You've done your initial cut at your revenue study, if it's parking or whatever. And you're spending a lot more money, but at that 90 days, you get another sort of, here's what, based on everything we've done, stop or keep going. You get another report. Staff is involved throughout the process, but council decides stop or keep going. And then it's the third one, which is, you're getting close to like being all the risks understood and priced and the design being roughly more or less done, permits in hand, those kind of things. Then you get the final decision before you make a financial commitment to move forward and go to close on the project. And again, a lot of times if this process is done right, it's a consent agenda because everybody, there's no mystery and there's no fear from an elected saying, what am I buying here?
And so it sounds like that process, you mentioned 90 days multiple times, that staff is doing a lot of the communication logically on a day-to-day sort of basis, but that at least it resurfaces to the air every 90 days or so, and repeatedly so.
And all is being done according to a budget and schedule that is adopted at the beginning and it's in a contract. So the interim agreement, which is in the statute, says, here's my 3 90-day processes. Here's what you're going to deliver. And here's the budget of what you're going to spend and so on.
And to help understand that a little better, you mentioned at the beginning that one of the sort of, as you weigh traditional RFPs versus unsolicited proposals and PP3s that tend to tie together somewhat, is the public trust factor.
Exactly.
And that public trust factor sounds like it's quite dependent on that 90-degree resurfacing, that it comes back from staff, because staff doesn't communicate with the public doesn't communicate with the staff for the most part.
So there's 4 task teams that are working and during those 90-day periods. You got technical, which is the engineers and architects and all those people. You got financial, which are your FA and your CFO and the counterparts of the developer looking at the revenue sources and uses. You've got legal, which is developers legal and city legal, thinking about the legal issues. And then the most important work stream is what we call the PR comms work stream. And that is an integrated team of your communications team, the developers communications team, under a very detailed communications plan, thinking about what they're communicating, how they're communicating, when they're communicating. When those 90-day milestones hit, it's a communications blitz of, here's why we're doing this project. Here's why it's a good value for the taxpayer. So you address those issues as you go along.
That seems like a key piece, again, coming back to the importance of public trust in the process. If the public side staff is basically helping out the PR side of the private side, that does not necessarily build public confidence. That means that the public is underwriting some of the PR side of the private part. And what really should be happening is the public side has the staff part of it has an obligation to communicate, put a lot of information out, and make sure that that's a two-way process, not just we're pushing out, hey, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and this private developer is the greatest thing, but trying to make sure that the public is in fact knowing and has opportunities to say, hey, that's nice, but that's not really what we're comfortable with, or whatever.
And so, I mean, typically what happens in these projects is once a month you have some public meeting. It oftentimes it's an open house or a public forum or something like that. Every other month you have a council presentation of kind of what's happening. Then you have a website where these communications are being constantly updated and then you have, most importantly, give us your feedback. And all of that feedback of what's being said and how it's being answered is all public record, and it's all being addressed as you go, so that it is a full 360 communication process. And council, if they're hearing something, they tell the team, go figure out what's going on over there and give me the answers I need to address it. But it's
so I don't know about 360 degree. I'm pretty happy with just two-way communication, but
it's an art.
it's
Communicating, it's an art.
It's definitely an art, and it's not easy. And obviously, P.T. Barnum, can't please all the people all the time, and that shouldn't necessarily be the goal. But a clearly strong two-way process sounds like it's pretty critical to keep that public trust.
It's essential.
Right,
Okay,
and it
thank you.
also, but it has to include the private party as well, because it's got to be transparency
Right.
all the way around. You have to be singing from the same song sheet. You have to really be working together to get that information out there.
Ms. Malega?
I think that I'm glad that you just touched on that, because to me, it's what you originally said, remind me back to the synergy. It's got to be synergy between this partnership that we have.
Right.
And even though Mr. McVoy thinks that it's, the public touting it, to me, it's more of, this is what we're doing together. And it's got to be a collaboration showing synergy, that we are hearing the request of the public. We're addressing them, but here's, again, it's just, to me, it's got to be more of almost like a dance.
Yeah. Well,
It's, to me, and I hate to say, I'm not simplifying it, but I'm simplifying it for the sixth grade. Anyway, I just think that when you said that originally, it took me back to the word you said, synergy, in the very beginning of the conversation, because I think that is important, that we continue to work together for the better of the community and the public.
well, it's unfair to ask staff to answer these technical questions that the private sector is the one that has that knowledge, right? And so when the communication comes out, it's our communication. It's not staff. Yeah, it's not. It's a collaborative process, and no communication goes out until the city communication staff has fully approved and vetted it. So, yeah, we're both responsible, and nothing crashes these deals more than poor communication.
Mhm.
And people that have done this enough know that the worst thing you can do is fail to communicate.
We have whole courses on that. Stakeholder engagement,
Mhm.
super
Yeah.
important.
But it's not a head count either.
No.
Which
You know,
I think is important to remember.
I was just on one of these with Secretary Wilson from Louisiana. And what he said is, it's not just about the meetings either. It's about when you're in the coffee shop. as
Oh,
Rodney
absolutely.
said, you're talking to folks, you're getting that feedback, you're sharing that feedback, and you're making sure that you are aware of any potential challenges.
Yeah.
And that you have the answers.
And we are a very small, very involved community.
No, and I've watched Boca, and just the obsession, and I mean, incredible positive way that they have just communicated. I mean, it's unbelievable. And
Well, we
and
should
they
take a note
know
of- yeah.
that their fate is based upon being totally transparent and communicating at every step.
We'll have to talk to them and see how they did it. Miss May?
So how do you navigate that if there's not consensus by the commission?
Something, Rodney, I was going to say something to this, and this kind of gets to that point, is make sure that you know what your problem you're solving is in this process, and make sure you know what your North Star is to solve the problem.
What
Because,
if not everybody agrees that the problem exists?
well, I mean, you may not get complete agreement on that, but you should be able to get to some element of a North Star for the majority, because if you can't sell to the community that there is a problem, bringing them a solution before they understand the problem will seldom go very well. And so I think there needs to be a lot of conversations, like, if we're talking about parking, is there a lack of parking? Do we have deteriorated facilities? And oftentimes it's the people who see the problem don't always articulate it because they think it's so obvious. And so it's worth the effort to take some time to make sure you articulate the problem well, so that then people appreciate it when they are given the solution.
So there's a process. There's a book that you all need to read. It's called How Big Things Get Done. And they study 16,000 projects valued over $1 billion in today's dollars. over the last 100 years. And they really go into, it's an Oxford professor. He goes into detailed analysis of why they failed to deliver cost, schedule, or qualitative benefits that were promised. And by the way, it's only 1 in 200 in history over all that statistical analysis that meets all of those criteria. What P3 does is it dramatically increases your chances of delivering that success on those 3 factors. But one of the things that they have found in why projects fail is that they never establish the why of the project. Why are we doing this? What is the benefit to our community to do these things? And one of the things that comes out of that is you think right to left. We're all geared to think left to right. We just start the project and we build it and then we open it. If you think about the why and what the outcomes are and the North Star that Tom was talking about, and then you think about it, like, what do I need to do to get there? And you come up with what we call a strategic roadmap. That strategic roadmap explains all of the right to left thinking that I'm talking about. And the
I mean, it's
why.
reverse planning.
Yeah.
That's what I do in my classroom.
Yeah.
You have to learn these things and here's how I'm going to get you there. So I
Exactly.
get
But
that.
once
That
you
makes sense.
publish that strategic roadmap and it's adopted by the commission and it says, that's it. That is the why. That is how, that's our navigation. Like on your phone, when you say, I want to drive to Detroit and it tells you how to get there. It is your navigation application that says, here's their journey that we're going to go through to get to our destination. And if you can articulate all that, the public will generally get behind it because they understand it and they're not.
In your experience, have there been factions who will not agree?
Yes,
Who
we-
will not think it's a problem or will not
We call those cave people.
cave people?
Yes, citizens against virtually everything. I mean, they're just, it are those people that, you know, they just will never get on board. But you're never going to get 100% consensus.
Right.
But you know it when you see it, like, yeah, we've hit the mark.
And the internal stakeholders, right? That's super important. That's folks in this room. For Howard County Courthouse, the association went there, I want to say 7 different occasions, different groups of folks, and just went through what it is and why, the why of, P3 and where the value could be. Start there if you're having those challenges.
So we need
Bring in
neighborhood
outside
meetings,
people.
outreach,
On
that sort of thing.
the Annapolis courthouse, $40 million garage, we had 114 meetings.
How much was that?
A $40 million
40 million,
garage.
okay.
Now, it was about the city docs and everything, but there were 114-minute meetings before we. I mean, and you can think about Annapolis. That is a intense, very publicly involved
No.
taxpayer, and that's what it took to get to. Yes, we got it.
Okay, Mr. McBoy.
I think you said something that really caught my attention. You said that for these things to not fail, it's really important that the community, obviously not 100%, because that's not a realistic number, but a decent majority agrees this is the problem. And I think if I'm hearing you right, if you get that, let's say it's 80%, 90%, the community says, yes, we have this problem. Then the process of what's the roadmap to get to Detroit, there might be a couple different variations. Maybe we move the risk a little this way, a little that way. But if you don't have agreement at a pretty broad level of this is the problem,
Don't do the project.
don't do the project. And what comes to mind as I'm thinking of this, a little different group than what we're talking about here, but urban planners, the growing wisdom, the best practice says parking garages should always be your last resort. You should try a bunch of other things first to make sure things that are low cost, that are reversible, make sure that you can't, in fact, solve this problem. Maybe you don't have this problem that you think you do. If you can't solve it with those other things, now you're going to have a lot of public support that says, hey, we tried several things. It improved the situation minorly, but didn't solve the problem. We can see where we're going, that the problem's going to get worse or better or whatever. Now you have the support to go to a more expensive type solution.
What is the cost of waiting?
Yeah,
You've mentioned a couple of times that, speed of delivery. What is the cost of bad decisions in terms of losing credibility as a government?
so
There's a cost that way too. And you got to weigh both forward and back.
parking should be built when there's demand for it. It's never the highest and best use of land. And it should always pay for itself.
And so you need the studies that show that
Show
all of
that.
that is in fact.
That's correct.
And that's where I come back
That's-
to when you have a unusual situation that we have. Now, I don't know how, maybe it's not unusual, but it's unusual here in South Florida that we are surrounded by communities that have some degrees of downtowns, concentration of businesses, restaurants, blah, blah, blah. All of the others, parking, we don't. And we also have a different character to our community that kind of fits with that free parking sort of thing. And so now before we say, yeah, you have a parking problem, probably it would be good to do some studies and make sure that we're really solid that we have that problem.
I'm working for a city of 150,000 in middle of Texas that has always had free parking. It is such an anathema to that city to even think about paying for parking. However, they don't understand why their downtown is blighted because they have all these surface parking lots that literally suck the life out of it. And so you have to go through that analysis of you cannot have an activated downtown area until you put the cars in structured parking. And then the question becomes, well, how do we migrate to that? I mean, like in Annapolis, when the parking went from $2, 3 hours free, $2 an hour after that, to $7 an hour from the minute you pull in, and then dynamic tolling for when you had events to like $10 an hour. And it was just, oh my God, how can that be? And then when you showed them that we're trying to do things like drive behaviors, we're trying to maximize the revenue so that your downtown doesn't get flooded. And when you started showing the why, they were like, okay, I get it. Because fact is, the parking, more than 75% of it was paid from people that weren't living there.
Right. Right.
So it's a complex analysis, but I can tell you every activated downtown will have structured parking eventually because it is the only way to do it.
And I think oftentimes you'll see in projects I've been involved with, the business community is ultimately happy to pay parking because it encourages actual movement of cars and availability of the assets for, it be at a restaurant, right? Rather than somebody maybe parking to go to their apartment overnight, then they're not going to do that. They're going to another spot and 3 different sets of customers can come to the restaurant. And so you oftentimes in free parking have an externalized cost. The question is just who's bearing it.
Thank you, Mr. Segrich.
Thank you. I think it also seems to come to bear that if you're focusing just on solving problems, you're not looking at the big picture. You've lost sight of that North Star, right? So if the idea is to get an activated downtown, there's certain building blocks that are required, which aren't necessarily a problem until you try to do better things. And I think that's where the progressive development model really shows its strength because we're focusing on the larger end goal. And that gives us the building blocks that we need to get there and lets us follow that. Whereas strictly adopting an RFP process, all you're doing is solving problems. And you never really get anywhere if you're just putting out fires. You're just sitting there spinning plates forever. You have to have that end goal. And I think that's where the progressive comes into play.
That book will really help you as you start thinking about this, because I mean, yeah, that's the way we think about traditionally as humans. We thinking left to right, we're just solving the problems, and we're not really focused on the big why and the big destination, and we miss the target.
And there's a case study that you're going to be sharing in a little bit.
I'm not sure we're gonna get there. So I said a minute ago about compliance with procurement laws. Now, on a progressive delivery, you have to bid things at the right time when it's time to bid them, so that you're bidding them in a very tight competitive way. So if you think about those 90-day processes that I was talking about, you want to bid out the work. You want to have the developer bid the work when the drawings and the design decisions are made, when it's time, so that you get that full competitive procurement and that sacred trust that you need, that you're spending the taxpayer dollars in a competitive way. So there's no skipping over traditional competition processes. It's just being done at the time that it's best to be done, so that when you do get through the interim agreement period and it's time to go to financial close, you have the lowest amount of contingency with the greatest amount of certainty.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we talked about these risk transfer mechanisms a minute ago. When a rating agency rates the city, that is what we call a portfolio risk. That is basically an artificial cost of capital, because that's based on the global ability to tax and raise taxes. When a rating agency rates a project, which all P3s generally are rated projects, then they're really analyzing the risk and how they're backstopped by liquid, bankable. And when a rating agency looks at a project rating, they look for the weakest link. So they will go through and say, what does that insurance policy do? How does it cover that risk? What does that bond do? Is it liquid? What does that letter of credit do? What does this do? And so it's the rigor that a rating agency puts around a P3 project is where you say, okay, this project is rated BBB-. How do I get it to a BBB+? Well, if I spend this money to create that reserve and this money to buy that insurance to get to a BBB+ or an A or whatever, then you're understanding that value of risk transfer, and you're understanding how it affects the cost of capital. So rating agencies' involvement in these P3 transactions is really important and illustrative of how risk affects capital cost.
Ms. Malega?
And going back to who pays for the rating agency. So again, does this go back to, depending on which way we go, progressive versus not?
No, I mean, no, the rating, the developer, when they submit a proposal, even in a fixed bid, they have got an indicative rating because they are pricing their capital, and they need to have the project rated to price their capital.
What if we wanted to have a project rated to see the viability of it and to look for those holes or those vulnerabilities, if you will?
Anybody could pay for it.
Is that normal that that a municipality would do that?
It is very abnormal, and it is a travesty.
Okay, thank you. That's all I wanted to know.
And it's a travesty?
Because you don't understand
The
the retained risk that
the
you have.
intricacies.
Okay.
You've created this artificial cost
right.
of capital that's not reflective of the risk of.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because we, and I will say, since I've been here for 4 years, we've spent a lot of money on a lot of studies that are still sitting on shelves somewhere
Right.
historically in the city. And I don't want us to hear this. And then the next thing I hear is that someone's advocating for us to go hire a rating agency to start rating potential projects that we have. So thank you for saying that it's a travesty. I appreciate that.
I mean, look, what rating agencies do by analyzing the risk and understanding the levers that you can pull to get a higher rating by either tending to the risk, mitigating the risk, backstopping the risk. It's such a illuminating process, because then you really begin to understand, oh, that's the risk I'm retaining. And it's actually me putting a 4% cost of debt on this project that a rating agency says should cost 6%. There's you're missing something in that equation.
So
Mr.
although,
McVoy?
thank you. At one point you said it would be a travesty for a municipality to ask for that, and it certainly is irregular. But I
It's not a
think
travesty to ask for it. It's a travesty not to ask for it.
oh, I think that was not understood.
To do it yourself.
And well, here's where I'm going.
My
Is
question was for us to do it. Does the municipality hire the agency, or does the developer or?
The developer is the one that knows how to pull those levers and do it in a way that optimizes that cost of capital, because at the end of the day, it affects the cost of the project, right? So it would be hard for the city to do that on its own, because the toolkit's in the developer's hands. It's not necessarily within the city's hands, but I'm
So the
saying
developer lets us know what their agency rating
it's
is,
all collaborative.
and we don't have to go back out and spend more money to do it again, was my
Yeah.
question.
and if I could finish my question, what I think I'm hearing is, regardless of how exactly the process gets initiated, there is a huge value added to having a rating agency look at it, because they don't care one way or the other whether the project goes, doesn't go, whether
Right.
it's this developer, that developer, this business. They don't care about any of that.
Right.
They're bringing experience and tools to say, you know, that idea, yeah, not maybe. Or, geez, you didn't consider a bunch of risk that is here. Maybe here's a way you can move that. And I guess what I think of is, and I'm a soil scientist, so I may say a lot of stupid things about business on a regular basis, but I'm not totally ignorant either. I've always thought of the idea of going, if a business goes for a bank loan, that's a very helpful process.
Right.
Because the banker says, Jim, you're a great guy. You have a wonderful idea. You haven't really fleshed it out. Come back with a solid business plan. I'll get my guys to look at it, or girls, and we'll sort of go over with you where you're shaky, where you're not so shaky, based on the other businesses that are similar. That external process, because I'm Jim or whoever I was there a minute ago, and I'm all excited about my project. You want some independent, experienced somebody, whether that's a rating agency or, and what I've suggested in the past for some of our projects, it might even be worth putting together whatever you would bring, essentially a business plan, even if you don't go through the process of bringing it to a bank or a rating agency or whatever, but put together, know what they would look for.
Exactly.
That helps you
It does.
think through the process, make sure, are we overlooking something that we shouldn't be?
It creates a tremendous rigor in
Exactly.
in
And
the-
some independence.
and it creates an underwriting understanding of this whole value for money risk transfer that I'm talking about. When you understand, if I pull this lever, then it drops this cost this much.
Mhm.
It's just a good process.
But that's any rating agency. I mean, that's,
Yeah, I mean, they all have their nuances around what they
Sure.
do better or not.
but again, hired by the developer.
yes,
Okay.
I just want to, we have two P3s basically going on right now. And I just wanted to ask the city manager, do they have ratings attached to them? You don't have to tell me what they are, but has that process been done?
Yes.
Or the attorney, if she knows? I don't know. Yes is the answer.
Answer is yes.
Can you share that with us at some point?
Yeah, I'll have to.
Okay, thank you.
if you have a revenue risk project that the bondholders are, buying that debt based on that rating agency rating, I mean, every time that has to be done if it's a revenue risk project. So now we're shifting into the last, third piece, I guess, which is the life cycle. So again, we've talked about cost of ownership. The question is how do you create the financial accountability through your finance structure to get the outcomes over the life of the asset? And we call them deductions. In other words, you don't make the payment unless the asset is performing according to the KPIs in the contract. So if a repair is not done in 2 hours and the building is hot, they don't get paid. There's a deduction for that. And there's a lot of those regimes that have been developed for all different kinds of assets. If you decide you want a DBM or a DBFM, it's payment for performance.
And that's part of that's once you get to the maintenance piece of it.
Yes.
Right, okay.
But again, if that's what you're buying at the outset, you want to go past that completion risk and you want to buy a performing building for the next X years. It's all in that initial deal. You can do it again on a fixed bid where you figure all that out at the beginning, or you can do it on a progressive where you say, what if I want to transfer this particular, if I've got a solar array on my building that is generating so many megawatts, you can get very granular about what it is you're trying to transfer. So these are the success factors. We talked about all that stuff. So here are the 10 success factors. And these are, what the industry sees as, if we can check these boxes, chances are it's worth our time and investment to pursue your project. And it's, we see these over and over again. When you're missing some of these, the projects tend never to make it off the ground. And ends up being a lot of wasted time and embarrassment and a lot of other things. So I'm just going to step through vision. This is the why. If we think that the government has its understanding of why it needs to do it, and that there is generally a consensus around the objectives and the public policy goals, it's probably going to succeed. Champion. Is there an executive leadership champion, and will they be there for as long as it needs to be to get the project to at least financial close?
So a tie to the vision is, if that public support for whatever the project is and understanding of the why isn't solid, you can easily have a situation that the elected champions get unelected. They're at risk, if it's in the interest of the executive part to make sure that that community support is really solid.
Unless they're cave people, yeah.
Unless they're what caves.
Yeah, we put vision at the top for the reason. I mean, that's just, it's essential. And then the people, the electeds that are behind that vision have to carry the water. So, the community support and commitment to go through the hard stuff. Stuff is not easy, and you gotta you can't lose your stomach.
Again, that vision, if that's solid, then we can get through what's the process to finance and do all this. If it's not, it's shaky.
Right. People understanding the business case, the community understanding the business case of why we're not only why we're doing it, but why we're delivering it this way and what value it's creating for them. It's critical. Communication, talked about that. Funding,
Federal.
yeah.
Might want to,
Spread across that one.
So the worst thing you can do is sell a project that's not affordable, right? And you've got to see the revenue streams from those four sources that I mentioned earlier. And you've got to be able to articulate them in a way that people feel like you're not betting their future on it.
And-
Experience.
that kind of ties into that idea of either the bank or the bank or the rating agency that you trust us, this thing is going to pay for itself. Well, that's
Okay.
nice. And I'm glad you believe that, but show me
Yeah,
what
show
the
me the
action,
math.
yeah,
Show me
show me the
math.
math,
Yeah.
you know?
You got to have the right experienced people, both on the public side and the private side. Your advisors, people, we know who the qualified advisors are and we know who they're not. And if we see unqualified advisors on the public side, it's just too painful.
Do we go to Yelp for that? How do we do, I mean, do we Google, like, I mean. No, I'm being serious. Like, we wouldn't know the first. Yeah.
We're a nonprofit.
Oh, okay.
We don't, we have an advisor toolkit on our website. We have lists. We have questions to ask your advisors.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to, I didn't think Yelp or Google was going to help at this
What
point.
does AI stand for?
It stands for the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure. When we started, it wasn't a popular AI. We're going to have to rethink our name.
Yeah, really. It's all fake. It's
No,
all
but
AI.
we are comprised of, a couple of hundred members that are sit on all sides of these equations. They're advisors, they're developers, they're lenders, they're rating agencies, they're this, they're that. We all are here to make sure that as much as we can, make sure every P3 is successful, because one screw up hurts everybody.
Can we contact you for follow-up questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
So another, big thing is, does the staff have the right resources, the right skills? And if they don't, are they getting the help that they need funded? It's just critical when staff feels like they have an unfunded mandate, or they're being asked to do something that they're only going to get in trouble for. It doesn't work. As I said, the value for money proposition is clearly understood and communicated. Is innovation a motivator, a driver for what you're trying to do through the project? Innovation, if you just want to do what you've always done and just, rinse and repeat, it tends not to be good grist for the mill for a P3. If you really want to innovate and sort of future-proof things, that complexity and that challenge is what makes P3 really create value. So now we're in the advisor piece. Tom, I've been doing a lot of talking.
Are you on mute?
Yeah,
Tom?
sorry. Yeah, I had to get myself off mute. Apologies. So typically, a lot of times in this, we say that you have the three legs of a stool with respect to advisory. You have financial, P3 structuring advisors, legal advisors, and technical advisors. Now, to Rodney's earlier conversation, I sometimes would say it would be more appropriate to say the four legs of a table, because I would also add in having strong communications advisors in a project too. And so with this, you need people that come in. Your financial advisors are going to help you. What are your revenue streams? What's that look like? And what kind of assets do you have? Do you have grant possibilities? Do you have monetization possibilities that may add into a project? They can help you look at, what are the potential risks of the project? We've talked about VFM. What is the risk that's associated? What's the value of that? Legal, one of the things to start with is say, do we have the authority? Now, Rodney's talked about the state of Florida authority that you have, but I don't believe you actually have your local authorization or ordinance to operate in. One piece of advice with that is that your advisors could help you put together what that ordinance would be to control your process going forward. But then obviously to look at it, you have a variety of legal things depending on the type of project. You have environmental, you have various permitting aspects, you have all of the negotiating aspects with regard to the private sector that you'll need on your side to have somebody that's there. One of my recommendations on that too is, and it goes to the point of ensuring you have good counsel. The Chicago parking meter deal, if you Google it, just suffice it to say it didn't go very well for the city of Chicago, most people would say. You look at other parking meters projects that have been done, I'll say Indianapolis because worked on it, they work out well. In Chicago, you had a law firm that wasn't engaged in the P3 industry. And that's one of the strengths. So you need to make sure whoever your advisors are, how many projects have they done? Who have they worked with? And what have the outcomes been of those projects for them? And that's true of really all of your. So I said technical advisors. What is your technical advisor? That's your engineering, somebody to look into the process. If it's a building, you want to make sure you have architectural. Now we're looking at the process here. What are your advisors helping you do? You want to run a clean, tight process throughout. You want to know, once again, we talked about working back from what our North Star is, what our end goal is, back through the process, and make sure from that, you've then looked at, do I have all the different attributes of this project? I'm not going to read everything on the slide, but you can see that you need to make sure your procurement's well run, that it complies with your local and state statutes. You need to make sure that you have a process that both gives the private sector, but also the public confidence that it was a well-run process. You want to make sure that as you get in, if we're talking about a long-term DBFOM project, the actual performance indications of the project, your performance specifications, both to how it's built, but how it's operated, are tremendously important. For you to get the value out of it, you need to define, when is it actually available to me? When is it not available to me? When am I actually going to reduce payment for a failure on the part of the private sector? And anyways, is there a next slide? Don't have them right in front of me, Lisa. So, but bottom line of this, then, you start with your scope. Yeah, and this gets to the process overall.
So
Start.
Oh, were you going to say something? Well, they were asking earlier about how you attract the best talent, the best developers with the most experience. Go ahead and speak to this one, Tom, about how you attract the best of class.
Yeah, so give confidence, you know what you're doing, where you're going. So have a well-scoped project. Have it lined out that you've got your authority in place and a ordinance and a process, because a clean process will give the private sector confidence. Reach out to the industry. You don't have to wait for the procurement to begin having discussions with the industry and say, this is what we're thinking. What do you need to see in order to have confidence in our project? Once again, also show the industry that your stakeholders. So for example, we've been talking about parking. Are your downtown businesses, are your major employers involved in this process so they have a place at the table, and that you're not going to have future problems with the project from these stakeholders. You want to make sure you do attract competition in most circumstances, because you're going to get the best value out of that. And seeing that there is an interest in competition will attract the private sector. They don't want to look at a deal and feel like, oh, this seems to be structured for a particular entity or a particular team. So you want to show that. Once again, I had mentioned transparency. I mean, that's important both legally, but from a perspective of, oftentimes if somebody can't defeat a project on the merits, they'll resort to trying to defeat it in the process. And the best way to ensure that that doesn't happen is have a transparent process. Once again, if you want people to come in, the bidders have to feel like there is an opportunity for me, for our team. If we're going to, these bidders put in hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars into bids on major projects. They want to know that they're fairly treated and that they're going to have an opportunity to win it if they're making that investment in your community. Once again, know what your goals are. Make sure that your internal processes are such that you're getting what you need to get whatever outside approvals. Do you need county approval? Do you need state environmental approval? Other approvals like that? Do you need NEPA process? Internally, one of the things I'll say is too, I think being able to point and say, this is our person internally, and that they're going to be responsible to driving it. They may not be the decision maker, but you need to have that internal person that helps ensure that you get good business decisions for the project. They may not be, obviously, you will oftentimes be the decision makers, or you'll have senior staff that do that, but somebody needs to live with it day to day so that you keep the project moving, so that the private sector knows there's a counterparty there. And, once again, you want to, for a successful project, really think through who is the best party for risk transfer. Can you do it better than the private sector? Then don't ask the private sector to do it, because they will charge you to do it. And that's a cost that you don't want to incur. You'd rather pay the private sector to take on risks, for example, schedule, where the private sector is well situated to manage that risk the best.
One of the documents that we recommend on these big complex projects that lays out all of this in a transparent way is a project charter, right? It's a project execution plan. It's how we're going to make decisions, how we're going to be transparent, how we're going to bid, how we're going to get inclusivity, how we're going to do all these things. And when you've gone through the process of sort of creating that project charter of these are our guiding principles about how we're going to conduct ourselves, it really is powerful. And it shows in that book how big things get done. One of the big tenets in that book is think slow so you can act fast. And that project charter is a big piece of that thinking slow, because if you've thought about the process and how to get a playbook for everybody to play by, it's really awesome. Again, we have all these documents that
Will be delivered tomorrow.
I was going to say, you just ordered it for everybody. God bless Amazon. Miss Malega.
What
don't
did
know.
we do before the A word?
Tell
So
me.
my question is, Commissioner May had alluded that we're in the process of some P3 conversations right now. When is it the right time to say, okay, this is a hefty proposal, and for our staff to do these weekly one-on-ones and to do this, it's taking away from, when is the appropriate time to say, okay, this is going to cost and we need this money?
right now.
Is that at the beginning, or when you're in it, is it too late, or
It's not
do
too
you?
late.
Okay.
I mean, I'll just give an example, Boca. The first thing that happened once they got the unsoliciteds was they sent out the fee structure for their advisors. It was a $375,000 down payment.
Okay, so Mr. Brown knows where I'm going to be going with this conversation. So at any point you can ask, correct? At any point?
Huh?
At any point in the process, you can ask.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
It's actually, I mean, it's required by the statute.
My follow-up conversation is, yeah, so,
That they pay the freight for the unsolicited proposal.
but is it okay, so let's say you haven't equated the hours that you didn't think the staff was gonna be putting into it, and you way underestimate it. Is there a way to go back and say, we're losing money at this point?
It says that you can do that in the statute, yes.
Okay, I mean, I hate to do those things because you want to let everybody know everything up front. But if you're into a project 6 months in and you're hearing from staff that they're spending 25 hours a week on this
Right.
unsolicited proposal, then we may need to assess on how do we get reimbursed for that staff
We
time.
can go back.
I
Okay.
don't know about going back. That seems a little,
Egregious.
or-
Oh, how about anticipating it at the beginning and then coming in under budget and you look good.
Well, the
Yeah,
statute or best practice contemplates you just go pins down until you get further payment.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Pens down
I
until you
said
get,
best practice is you go pins down on evaluation until you get further payment.
because I would
until you
love
get
to see
payment.
our legal bill from an agreement that Christy just worked on.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
thank you very much. Okay,
I mean, yeah, we've pretty much covered it. So.
okay, if there's any more, it's 10:08, any more questions? And we can contact them, which is very helpful, because you drive home and go, ugh.
No,
And
we're-
this will be available, the slideshow will be available to us. Mr. Brown, it's your turn.
Yes, I
Yes.
will push this out to all of you guys tomorrow.
Okay.
So we got the updated version right before the meeting, so
Okay.
push out the.
She's got cards.
Starts.
This has been very enlightening, very interesting. Mr. Brown, what you want to say?
I do have one. I wanted to thank all of you
Yeah.
for first and foremost, because this was definitely much needed. We had some CRA members as well, board members here. Hello, Drew. So as far as next steps, I've pulled in, they provided some good examples as well, but I've pulled a lot of examples from kind of all over the place. What you find is that a lot of the language is kind of consistent as far as the process and the policy. What I would like to do is put together a draft that I can bring forward to everyone, kind of based on, and I'll do with you guys as well, kind of best practices, what I've seen, and then kind of circulate that and then start that as part of our conversation to see what might work best for us here in the city. And I think that might be a good starting point for us to kind of build on.
Are you aware of like where we are at with our project that we're talking about, the parking garage? Okay.
No,
well,
I didn't go into.
Okay, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did.
We just happen to be
whole
talking about
basis was
parking
to kind of
garage.
lay out everything right now for everyone,
Okay.
but obviously with everything kind of
Well, we're gonna get a lot more and to have the plan in place from here's my proposal.
correct.
Okay, well, that's gonna cost you $8 million. Right. Oh, you know
Yeah,
what I
so
mean.
kind of putting
8.5.
something together. So because we have gotten some things before that I think had there been this policy in place where you needed to have some type of payment up front for staff time and everything,
Mhm.
they wouldn't have come forward at all.
Right.
And some of those, and William's looking at me because I know you know the one I'm talking about. We didn't waste your time because there's some that we just know that aren't. Yeah, there are certain things that just aren't. Yeah, they're not something that I know that would be something that you guys would be in favor of. So that is where I would like to, if that's okay collectively with all of you.
The only thing I would add is, I would encourage you to look both at Strong Towns thoughts on P3s and, the Government Finance Officers Association thoughts on P3s as additional sources of information.
Yep.
And we work very closely with GFOA.
Yeah, and our
Yeah.
finance director is part of the organization as well. So
Okay, so no more questions. Do I have a motion? I want to thank you very, very much. I want to thank the folks that have been listening. This is not the most, it ain't sexy, but it's very important. And I want to thank you very much. And our continued conversations will be helpful. Thank you
Motion
very
to-
much. Do I have a second?
You don't need a motion. It's a workshop.
Oh, we don't need a motion. Good night.
It just adjourn.